Hello everyone, this is Neil from Edureka and welcome to today's session on Java programming. Now, you may all have heard of Java and would be wondering where to start, and this session exactly concentrates on that. This session will give you a good fundamentals with respect to programming using Java. Now, without wasting any more time, let's move forward and look at today's agenda. Now, we'll start off by understanding what is a variable and we'll discuss the various data types that are present in Java. Then we'll talk about the various operators as well as the various control statements and loops that are available in Java. Moving forward from there, we'll be discussing about how you can create as well as work with arrays and strings, and finally we'll be talking about functions and classes and objects in Java. So are you guys clear with today's agenda? Can I have a quick confirmation in the chat box? Okay, Adam says clear, Mayank says looks interesting. Okay, Sandeep is asking me, will there be practicals? Definitely, Sandeep, this is a session that concentrates more towards your practical learning, but there will be some fundamental theoretical knowledge before you move into practicals. So before we move ahead and go into the first topic, let's first install Java Development Kit on your system. Now, to do that, all you need to do is go to Java's website and search for JDK. Let me just show you how it's done. Now, all you need to do is open your browser and search for JDK download, and that will redirect you to Oracle's page. So click on the first link, and here you can see the option download Java Development Kit. So just click on it and then you can go forward and select the version according to your system configuration. If you're using a Linux or if you're using a Mac, you can choose the corresponding version. So just go ahead, download it, and then it's a simple process of clicking next, next, next. Okay, so now that all of you have downloaded and installed Java on your system, it's time we configure the path of Java. Now, if you've not changed the default path where Java is installed, you can find it inside your C drive. If you go into programs, and then you can find Java. So go inside JDK folder and then go to the bin folder. Now copy this location. Once you've copied this, go back to your My Computer, right click and go to Properties option here. Now once you've got this screen, just click on Advanced System Settings and select the Environment Variable option. Now here, if you do not have a variable known as path, then you can go ahead and create a new variable. Just click on New, specify path, and then just give the directory that you had copied to. Again, remember it is C/program files /java jdk/bin. So if you've changed it to a different location where you've installed Java, go into the JDK folder and take the path to the bin folder. Just copy this and click on OK. And if you have path already set, just double click on it. Go there, put a semicolon and give the new path. So please go ahead and do the same. In case if you're facing any troubles, you can let me know. I'll be able to assist you. Okay, so now that all of you have configured the path of Java on your system, to check if it is correct, just launch your command prompt and type javac. Now when you do that, you'll be getting these set of instructions. If you have not configured the path correctly, you will not be getting this. You'll be getting an error. If any of you are getting this error, let me know so that I'll be able to assist you with it. So now that all of you have downloaded and configured the Java path on your system, let's go ahead and download an IDE, that is the Eclipse. Now you can go ahead to Eclipse website and download this IDE. Now this IDE would be where you'd be writing your program as well as executing it. So just go back to your browser and search for Eclipse download. So just click on the first link and here you'll be finding the options for Eclipse IDE. Now at presently this is Eclipse Neon that you would be downloading. If you want for an older version as well, that is available here, and according to your system configuration you can choose a corresponding option. So what this will basically do is it will give you a zip folder. Once you've extracted it, you can find the Eclipse IDE directly present there. Just double click on it to launch the Eclipse IDE. So once you specify your default workspace path, just click on OK. So this is what your basic Eclipse IDE would look like. Now let's start off by creating a new project folder. Just click on New and then here just select Java project. Now you can go ahead and name your project. So I'm going to call it Java Programming and then just click on Finish. So I hope you guys are following me till here. Okay, James is asking me, why do I need an IDE? So James, basically an IDE is a common application where you can write your code as well as compile and execute it. Because if you're going for an alternative, you can use a text editor like Notepad++. Then again you need to individually compile it, and then you need to check if there are any errors, and then you can go ahead and execute it. But using an IDE, it makes it quite easier. Even when you write an error, or if you've written a wrong syntax as well, the IDE will immediately prompt it. So it becomes easier for you to write your code, and Eclipse is one of the most popular IDE used in the industry presently. Does that answer your question, James? Alright. So moving forward, let's go into the first topic, that is variables. Now, variables are basically nothing but a memory location that is going to be used to store a specific value. Now this value is anything that you want. So let's look at the example here. Now I have an integer type. Now don't worry about the types right now, we'll be talking about that next. But for your understanding, integer basically is a numerical, float is a numerical value itself, but it stores decimal value, and boolean is quite straightforward, it either stores a true or false value. Now when you write this statement, a block of memory is allocated for the variable x, and you're going to be storing the value 25 in that. Similarly for y, you're going to be allocating memory and you're going to be storing 3.142857 there. Finally for boolean as well, you'll be allocating 1 bit of memory where you're going to be storing true or false value. So I hope with this you've got an understanding of what a variable is. Okay, Nisha is clear, so is Roshni. That's great. So now that you've understood what a variable is, let's talk about the different data types that a variable can belong to. Now, a data type basically is a classification for every variable that you're going to be using. Now, you can't always have a single data type that will store different kinds of variable, so you've classified it and made it easier for the user as well as the machine to understand. Now, as we had discussed earlier, if you look at the same example, I have an integer value, I have a float value, I have a boolean value. Basically, this is telling the machine that I need some space for an integer variable and I'm going to store the value 25 in that. So that is what exactly you mean by this statement. Similarly for float y and boolean b as well. So basically you're telling the system that I have created a variable known as x which belongs to the type integer, I have created a variable y that belongs to the type float, and I have created a variable b that belongs to the type boolean. So please allocate the required memory to each of them. Okay, so Sandeep is asking me, do all of them take the same memory space? No, Sandeep, each of them take a different memory space, and that is exactly why you need data types. Now, there are certain ranges with respect to what each data type can store as well. Now, again, within respect to integers itself, you have 4 types. You have short, you have byte, you have int, and long. But the value that you can store in between them is different. Now, if you take an example of byte, in a byte you can only store a numerical value that is between -127 to +128. So if you want to store a value that is greater than that in a byte variable, it becomes impossible for you to do that. It may store that value, but it may not store it correctly. So if you have a bigger number and you want to store it inside a variable, it should belong to a different data type. And that is how memory is allocated. Based on the data type, corresponding memory is allocated. Does that clarify your question, Sandeep? Alright, so any questions with respect to variables or data types? Okay, so Nisha is asking me, are these the only data types that are there in Java? No, Nisha, we're going into that. I'm going to request you to be a bit patient. We'll talk about that in the upcoming slides. Okay, moving forward, we have mainly 4 primitive data types that are supported in Java. You have integer, you have float, you have character, and you have boolean. Now we've talked about both integer and float. Now integer is used to store a numerical value, whereas a float is used to store a numerical value with a decimal point value as well. So basically it's the precision that makes them different. So if you want to store the decimal point value, you're going to be using a float instead of an integer. And then you have character. Now character is very straightforward. Using a character, you can store a single character present there. And finally you have boolean. Boolean is used for storing either true or false. So don't worry, we'll be talking about each of them one by one. We'll start off by talking about integers itself. Now again, as I've told you, integer is used to store numerical values, and there are 4 different types of integers in Java. Now the first type is a byte. As the name suggests, it takes 1 byte of memory, and it can store a value that is between -128 to 127. Now if you want to store a number that does not fall in this range, that is greater than this range, then you can go ahead and use the next type, that is the short. Now in short, you can go, the range increases, you're going to store -32,768 to +32,767. Again, if you want to store even greater number, you have int and long. So always remember to use the correct data type for your variable, because each of them occupies a certain amount of data. Your byte takes 1 byte of memory, your short takes 2, int takes 4, and long takes 8. So make sure you use the correct data type, because memory management is also something that you need to be aware of while you're working with Java. Okay, so now let me show you how to declare a data type that belongs to an integer data type. So let's begin by first creating a new class file. Now one thing you need to remember is that every code that you're going to be writing in Java is going to be written inside a class. Now we'll be talking about what exactly is a class and how it is going to be useful in the later part of the session. But for now, just remember that every code that you're going to be writing is going to be part of a class. Now just click on the C icon present here, or you can go inside your project folder. You have SRC and GRE system. Just right click on SRC and then you get a new option there. So here you can click class option. Now it's time we specify the name of the class. Let me call it data types. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to click this option of public static void main string args. Now this option enables this function to be present in your class file. Now I'll tell you why this is important. For now, just click on finish. So you've basically created a new class file. Now the reason that I click the option to create public static void main is because your program execution begins inside this function. You may have codes written before this, there may be codes written after this function as well, but always remember the execution of your program begins from your main function. So this is what you call a function. So clear? Okay, so now let's go ahead and declare a first data type. So we've talked about byte, short, int and long. Now how you're going to define a variable is basically you have a three-step process. First you're going to specify the data type. Now generally for storing numerical values we're going to use int because it has a medium range and occupies a medium amount of memory. So it's preferred that you use integers to store numerical values, but you can go ahead and choose whichever suits your requirement correspondingly. Now int, then you need to specify the variable name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my first variable as num1. Basically what I'm telling is I'm going to create a new variable called num1 of the type integer. Okay, now with this you need to put a semicolon to end your statement. Now in Java, any statement that you're writing, every line requires you to put a semicolon. So never forget to put your semicolon, and this is one of the key features that your Eclipse IDE provides you. So sometimes when you're working with a text editor, then you may forget to put in a semicolon at some part of your code. Now imagine that happens when you're writing about 2000, 3000 lines of code, and it becomes tedious for you also to sit and search where you have missed out on. Now in Eclipse, if you do not put a semicolon, then what happens is immediately you are notified that a semicolon is required to end the statement. So you can just go here and you can see syntax error, insert semicolon to complete block statement. So I hope with this you've understood why we need an IDE, James. This would have clarified your doubt as well. Okay, that's great. So now let's say you want to declare multiple variables of the same type. Now this is again quite simple. If you have the same data type, rather than writing again, if let's say if you want to declare int num2, then you don't have to write it like this completely. All you need to do is go back to the data type where you're specifying, put a comma, and then you can specify the next variable name. So let's say num2, I can write it like this. Now I have declared two variables, num1 and num2, that belong to the integer type. Okay? And let's say while you are working with these variables, you want it to already have a basic value. So this is something that you may come across. Let's say you are going to use pi as part of your program, and in the beginning itself you wanted to have the value of 3.14. So what you can do is there's this process known as initialization. So initializing a variable at the time of declaration. That is, whenever the variable is created, give it a fixed value. Now I can say int num1 is equal to 10. Now what it basically does is when the memory is allocated for the variable num1, it will see that it's type integer and it will see an initialization value of 10. So immediately what the compiler would do is that it will allocate memory for num1 variable and then it will store the value 10 inside that. Are you clear with this? Alright, so the other way that you can assign a value to a numerical after declaring is a very straightforward option. Let's say num2 is equal to 15, semicolon. So this basically means that my num2 is going to take the value 50. This can be done any part of your code, but it's suggested every time before you use a variable that the declaration starts. So always declare your variable at the start of your program and only then go forward and use them. Okay, so these are some of the best practices. We'll be talking about them simultaneously as we're learning new concepts. So that way you will also begin to write codes more efficiently. And one of the other key things you need to remember while writing codes in Java is to follow the indentation. That is, let's say this is a set of codes written inside this class. So there's a tab space associatedly given. So every time that you're writing a code inside something else, make the correct space indentation. So that way it becomes easier for you to read the code as well as it becomes easy for you to debug the code as well. Okay, so now that we have talked about the integer data type, let's talk about the next data type, that is the floating data type. So you've seen how the floating data type works. Now floating data type is used to store a numerical value that has a decimal point value associated with it. Now in Java we have two kinds of floating data types. You have the float data type as well as you have the double data type. Basically they're used for different precisions again like you've seen, and the memory used by both of them is different. You're using 4 bytes here, you're using 8 bytes here. But the range of numerical values that they can store along with the decimal point is quite different. Okay, now again your declaration of floating point variables is also quite straightforward. Now I'd suggest that you use double instead of float because double is more precise as such and it's something that we all work around with. Now double, let's say num3, and then you can do that. Now again here, let's say you want to give associated with the decimal point value, let's say equal to 15.5678. That also can be done. So every time you're declaring a variable, you're free to initialize it. So any doubts with respect to the integer data type and float data type? Okay, Mayank has a question here. Mayank is asking me what will happen if I give a decimal point value to an integer number. That's a very good question, Mayank. So let me show you what happens here. So first of all, I'll just try giving here 15.3567. So you can see straightforwardly Eclipse is telling me that this is a type mismatch and cannot be converted. Basically what you're trying to do is that you're going to assign a decimal pointed numerical value to an integer number. But let's take it another way. Let's say 22 divided by 7. Now this operation, as we all know, is going to give me the value of pi, that is 3.145, and then it keeps non-terminating. So let's see what value you're going to get. Now all you need to do is you need to print out the value of num2. Now to print anything in Java, you can use the statement system.out.println. So you can see here these are the functions that I can perform. So basically just click on the first one, and here you need to specify what you want to print. Now I want to print my num2. Let's say num2, and then let's save this and run it. To save, just press Ctrl S, and to run, right click and you can go to the option run as Java application. So can you see here what is happening? 22 divided by 7, which would give me 3.14 value, is getting converted to only 3. The decimal point value is getting rejected because it's of a type integer. So does that answer your question, Mayank? Okay. So the next data type that we'll be talking about is the character data type. That basically means that you're going to store a single character. Now the range in which the character can store is between 0 to 65,535. Now you may be wondering, why does it need such a big range if it's going to only store your character? Now this character does not just contain your alphabets, but it also contains your special characters as well as numerical characters as well. Now I'll show you one interesting fact here. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to declare a new character type. Character X is equal to, I'll assign it a numerical value, let's say 100, and then I'll just print the value of X. Okay, any guesses as to what this answer would be? Okay, so I've got a variety of answers here. So I'll show you the output itself and then we'll figure out from there. So just run as, I'm getting the output to be D. Think again, I'm storing 100 in X, but my output is coming as D. Okay, so I'm not going to put you people into any more trouble as such. This is basically because 100 is basically the translation of ASCII equivalent D. So ASCII is a standardized system that most computers follow, where there's a corresponding numerical value associated for every character that you use. Your A starts at 97, and then if you add 4 letters from there, you get your D. So basically here what happens is, even if I give it a numerical value, when I'm trying to print it, it detects it to be a character type, and then it will convert this numerical value to ASCII equivalent of it, and it's printing D. Now, if you want to see the complete list of ASCII codes, all you need to do is just search it on Google. You'll get the complete list where you'll be understanding which corresponding character has which corresponding ASCII value. Okay? Alright. So the last data type that we're going to be talking about is a Boolean data type. Now, Boolean is quite straightforward. A Boolean is used to store either the value true or false. Now you may be wondering why it needs to store true or false. This is basically a flag for you to check certain things. Now always true or false helps you understand if a certain statement is true or a certain condition is true and so forth. So in all those cases you can use a Boolean variable. Okay, and a Boolean variable just takes one bit of memory when you compare to all the other data types. This is because your true or false in terms of machine memory is either 0 or 1. So therefore it is quite easy for you to store a Boolean variable. With this, we've talked about the 4 primitive data types in Java. Any questions about any one of them? So Stephanie is clear, so is Mayank, Sandeep, Adam, Nisha, Roshni. That's great to see, guys. So again, one thing I'd like to emphasize on is that at any point, if you do have any doubts, any queries, any point that you're not clear, you want me to repeat, please let me know in the chat box right away so that I can do that as such. I don't want you guys to have any doubts at any point. I want you to have a complete learning experience. Okay, now keeping that in mind, let's go to the next topic, that is the operators. Now basically, to define an operator, it's a construct through which you're going to manipulate the values of an operand. Now again, your operands are your variables here. So basically there are 4 types of operators present in Java. You have your arithmetic operator, you have your relational operator, unary operator, and logical operator. So we'll talk about each of them one by one. Let's start with arithmetic and relational operator. Now, your arithmetic operators are quite straightforward. You have your addition, you have your subtraction, multiplication, division, and then you have a new operator that is known as modulo operator. Now, this is something new. Most of you who are not familiar with programming language will be coming across. Basically, what your modulo operator does, it does a simple division itself like your division operator. But the difference between modulo operator and your division operator is that when you perform division there, you get the quotient as your output. But when you perform a modulo division, then you get the remainder to be the output. Now I'll show you this example here. Let's come back to our Eclipse. Let me just remove this. And let's say my num3, let me just clear all this. Now my num2 is equal to 5. I'll declare 2 more variables, let's say num3 and num4. Okay, so in one, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to say num3 equal to, I'll change it to 3, num1 divided by num2, and my num4 I'll do a modulo division. Now modulo division is denoted by percentage. So here I'll change it to num3. Now if you don't want to write the complete statement, what you can do in Eclipse is just type sys out and then press Ctrl plus space. So this will actually convert the sysout statement to your system.out.println. So this is basically a shortcut in Eclipse. Let me just change it to num5 and then here print num4. Now if you run this, you can see the difference. One is giving me output as 3, the other is giving me the output as 1. So I know the answer should be 3.333 non-terminating, but since it's taking an integer, it is going to be stored inside an integer value, it's rejecting the decimal point value and it's taking only the whole part. So basically my num3 is equal to 3 because I'm performing a normal division, but my num4 is equal to 1. That is, when 10 is divided by 3, you're getting the remainder to be 1, and that is exactly what your modulus operator is giving you. So I hope you guys are clear with respect to the modulo operator. Alright, so next set of operators that we're going to be discussing is relational operator. Now one thing you guys need to always remember is that a relational operator will give you the output to be a Boolean value. That is, when you perform an operation using a relational operator, your output is going to be a Boolean value. Now there are 6 Boolean operators that we're going to be discussing. First off is going to be equal to. Basically what an equal to operator does is that it checks if the value of A is equal to the value of B. Now this requires you to use 2 equal to characters here. If you use a single equal to, what happens is that the value of B gets assigned to the variable A. So remember, when you're checking equal to, always use 2 equal to. Now go back to your Eclipse. Let's say I'll remove the statement and I'll write num3 equal to num4, and if you run this, you can see the output to be false because my number 3 is not equal to number 4, because one is giving me output as 3, the other is 1. So therefore they are not equal to. Okay, but let's say now the opposite of equal to operator is not equal to. That is, if value of A is not equal to value of B, then it will return you an output of true, but if it is opposite, you get a vice versa. Okay, then comes your greater than operator. That is, if the value A is greater than B, it will return you true, otherwise you'll get the output to be false. Similarly, you have less than, but here you also have an additional to your greater than and less than. You have greater than and equal to. Now that basically is denoted by a greater than sign followed by an equal to sign. Now this basically checks if the value of A is greater than or equal to the value of B, and you have the opposite of this, that is lesser than or equal to. Now I'll just show you these operators in Eclipse itself. So you've seen equal to, I'll just change it to not equal to, save it, and then you can directly run it from here. So just click on run. So now which was giving me false has given me true. That is, these two are not equal to. Now let's say if we can check if num3 is greater than num4. That is true because 3 is greater than 1. Similarly, let's say I'll just copy this. I'll change it to less than. I'll make this greater than or equal to, and I'll change it to lesser than or equal to. So can you just quickly give me the outputs of these operations? You can type it down in your chat window and send it to me. So okay, most of you have given me the right answer. Let's just save this and run it. So you get true, false, true and false. So I see almost everyone has given me the same answer. That's great, guys. I can see that all of you are following up till here. Okay. Okay, Roshni has a question here. Roshni is asking me, where do we use the relational operators? Okay, definitely. That's a really good question, Roshni. Now, relational operators are extensively used in conditional statements, and we'll be talking more about that when we reach the conditional statement topic. So I request you to be a bit patient, but rest assured your question will be answered when we reach conditional statements. Okay, so the next set of operator that you're going to be talking about is the unary operator. Now unary operator basically means you're going to be working with just one operand, okay, that is one variable, and then you're going to be performing a specific operation. Now there are basically two types of unary operator. You have your increment and decrement. Now as the name suggests, increment increases the value of that variable and decrement reduces the value of that variable. But one thing you need to understand is that the increment and decrement always happens with respect to 1. That is, you either increment the present value by 1 or you decrement the present value by 1. Okay, so basically even when you perform increment or decrement, there are two ways that you can perform it. You have your pre-increment and you have your post-increment. Similarly, you have pre-decrement and you have post-decrement. So I'll just help you understand how these two differ. Now when you're using pre-increment, now in this case what happens is that the value is first incremented and then you're going to be using it. But when you're using a post-incremented, what happens is first you're going to use that value and then you're going to increment that value by 1. That's the same in case of pre-increment and pre-decrement. Okay, so you may not be clear with respect to this, so we'll go back to our Eclipse. Let me just comment this. Now to comment a single line in Eclipse, you can just use double slash, or let's say if you have a multi-line comment, then you can use a slash followed by a multiplication star, and then wherever you want it to end, similarly put a star and then a slash. So basically this is a multi-line comment, and for a single line comment just put double slash. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let's say sys out. Now here we all know the value of num1 is 10. So what I'll do is, let's say num1 plus plus, copy this, and here I'll make it plus plus num1. Okay, so I want you to give it a quick guess as to what this value would be. Similarly, let's try decrement operator as well, so that way we can cover both concepts and you'll be clear with respect to that. Okay, so quickly in your chat box, give me the output of these four operations. You have num1 plus plus, plus plus num1, num1 minus minus, and minus minus num1. Quickly guys, the value of num1 is 10. Remember that and give me the outputs. Okay, so most of you have given me the outputs. Let me just run this. 10, 12, 12 and 10. Any doubts? Okay, Nisha is still not clear. Let me write it down here for you. So at this point, what happens to my num1? I'm printing num1 and then I'm incrementing its value by 1. So first I'm going to print the value 10 and then I'm going to increment it to 11. Okay, in my next statement, what happens? I already have a value of 11, but before I print it itself, I'm going to increment it and only then am I going to print it. So my output value is 12. Similarly, when you look at the other two operations, it's quite inverse of the same thing. You're going to start off with 12 and then you're going to decrement it after printing to 11. And here finally, you're first decrementing from 11 to 10 and only then are you printing it. Is that clear now, Roshni? Okay. Now, the final operator that we're going to talk about is the logical operator. Now, basically there are three types of logical operators that you'll be working on. You have your logical AND, you have your logical OR, and you have logical NOT. Now, your logical AND will only return true if both the operand value is true. Okay, but at the same time your logical OR will return a value to be true if either one of the two are true. So what I will do is, let me just run that. Let me show you. I'll just extend this comment. Here let's say true. We'll start off with logical AND. Now that's denoted by double AND and false. Okay, so as I had told you, you get the output to be true only and only if both the statements are true. So if I save it and if I run it, it's going to give me a value of false. So I'll just copy this and show you how the four outputs would look like. Let's say you're working with true and false, and then you have false and true. And finally you have true and true as well. So again, if you run this, you get false for every output where you have at least one statement to be false. Until and unless you have both the operands to be true, you do not get the value to be true. Okay? Now, before Roshni, you asked me the same question. You're going to use these logical operators as well in your conditional statements where you're working with multiple conditions. Okay? Sure. At the same time, let's say if you perform an OR operation, I'll just copy this entire thing. Now for an OR operator, you're going to use double pipes. Just save it and let's run it. So can you see the contrast here? Where earlier I had only one true, now I have only one false statement. Everything else is true for me when I'm using an OR operator. So in an OR operator, if you have at least one of the conditions to be true, then it gives you an output to be true. Okay, now your final operator, that is NOT, it basically converts the current value of it. So let's say if your value of A is true, then when you use a NOT operator, it converts it to be false. Now this is quite straightforward option. Your NOT operator is denoted by an exclamation mark. So any questions with respect to the various operators that we have discussed till here? Okay, Adam is clear, so is Sandeep, Roshni, Nisha, Stephanie, James, Mayank. That's great to see, guys. So now that we have talked about the operators, let's start about the conditional statements. So again, coming back to your, now this is where your questions would be answered, Roshni. So thank you for your patience. Now, first conditional statement that you're going to be seeing is an if conditional statement. Now, a conditional statement is used in cases where you want to execute certain set of codes only and only if that condition is true. Now, your conditionals could involve your relational operators as well as your logical operators, but only if that condition is met will the code get executed. Now, you can see at the image here how from the start when we reach an if condition, only if it's true does it execute the if code, but if it's not true, it jumps ahead and does not execute the condition that is written inside the if code. Alright, so let me show you the if program. So let me begin by creating a new class. Let's call it control statements. Now here let's say int a equal to 25 and I have b equal to 15. Now comes my if statement. So use if. Now let's use a relational operator here. Let's say a greater than b. This is my condition. Then print a is greater than b. Okay, so just save it. Let's execute it. You can see here a is greater than b, that is this code is executed because this condition is true. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to change it to lesser than, that is a is lesser than b. Then what happens? Save it, let's re-execute this. So here you can see a blank screen. That means this statement did not get executed, and that is because my condition was not met. So I hope with this you've got an idea of how the if condition works. Okay. Now, what do you do when you have multiple conditions that need to be checked? And this is exactly where your else if comes into picture. Now, the first thing that you're going to do is always going to check your if condition. Now, if it is directly true, then it goes to my if code, executes it and ends it. But if it's not true, then I can go ahead to the next condition that is written inside the else if. So it'll check the second condition. If it is true, it'll execute the code written inside, and you can have multiple number of else if conditions written like this parallelly. Okay, so I'll just show you another example of that. But before you go into that, now there's always a case where if none of your conditions are met, then what you're going to do? So in that case is you're going to write the else statement. Now the else statement is called when none of the conditions that you have written would meet the requirement. Now let's go back to our program. Here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say else if, I'll change this back, a less than b, and then I can open new parenthesis, b is greater than a. Okay, and finally what I'm going to write is else a and b are equal. So if the first condition, if a is greater than b, then you're going to print a is greater than b. If a is lesser than b, then you're going to print b is greater than a. And if these two conditions are not met, then definitely they are equal to each other. So I'm going to print a is equal to b. So are you clear with respect to how the if-else ladder works? And does this answer your question, Roshni, on how we use the relational operators? Okay, that's great. So apart from the if-else statement, you also have another conditional statement that is known as switch case statement. Now, your switch case statement is something that you'll use to check expressions, but not expressions, not conditions. Now, this expression could either be a specific value or it could even be a string. Now, one thing you need to be aware of is the option of checking strings in switch case came only after Java 7. So if you're using a version before that, you cannot use strings as part of your expressions. I'll just show you how you can use a switch case statement as well. So I'll just remove this. I'll make it equal to 3. Now let's say switch of A. Now my first case is equal to 1. Then print Monday. So I hope with this statement itself you would have got an idea. If A is equal to 1, that means it's Monday. Basically I'm just checking which day of the week it is. Okay, now when you're working with switch case, always you need to write a break statement after the switch case. After you've written your statement inside that case, you need to write a break statement. So write break here. Okay, so the next case is case 2. I'll just copy this. I'll say Tuesday. Let's say case 3. Wednesday. And finally, you have this concept again similar to your else statement that is known as default. That is, when you write your default statement, you can write now here you don't need to specify break. Now here what happens is that it checks case and the value of A to be 1. If it is true, then it will print Monday. If it is 2, it will print Tuesday. If it is 3, it will print Wednesday. But if it does not match any of these 3 values, it will print invalid input. Now let me just save it. Let me run it. So it's printing Wednesday. I'll change it to 1. You can see it's printing Monday. Now let me change it to 5. It's showing me invalid input. So this is not in my range of cases that I have considered. Okay. So this is what your default value comes in. Now as to why you need to write break. Now from each of the statement, I'll keep removing break. And I'll change this value to be 1. So if you save it and if you run it, you can see it is printing every case after that case as well. So it is checking, it is seeing that it's true, it's Monday, but then it's also finding the statement to be true and printing the case for Tuesday, statement for case 3 that is Wednesday, as well as the default case. So until and unless you put a break here, it does not come out of the switch case and it prints all the case statements. So are you clear with respect to how to work with switch case? Adam is clear, so is Mayank, Roshni, Nisha, James. That's great to see, guys. So moving forward, let's talk about the next concept, that is loops. Now what basically is a loop? Now the main objective of a loop statement is to help you execute a certain set of statements multiple number of times. Now let's say you want to add the first 10 numbers in a series. Now rather than consecutively writing num1 plus num2, num1 plus num2, num1 plus num2, what you can do there is that you can store that statement num1 plus num2 is equal to num3 inside a loop and then run it 10 times. So therefore you're reducing the code redundancy as well as you're improving the efficiency of that code. Now this is a basic example of a loop statement. So this is in case of a while condition. So you're first checking the condition. If it is found to be true, then you're executing the block and you're going to keep repeating this till the condition is found to be false. Once it's found to be false, you're going to exit from that loop. Okay. So we basically have 3 types of loop that we'll be talking as part of today's session. We have a do while loop, you have while loop, and you have for loop as such. So I hope you've got a simple understanding of what a loop is, because we'll be deep diving into each of them individually next. So the first loop that we will be discussing is the do while loop. Now your do while loop is same as a normal while loop itself, but the difference here is that you're going to first execute the statement and only then you're going to go ahead and then check the condition. So this is the basic syntax of a do while loop, where you're first going to write the keyword do, following which you're going to specify the statement or statements that you want to repeat multiple number of times, and once the statement has been executed, you come out and the while condition comes in where you check the condition. Now if the condition is true, then you go back and then you execute the statement till the condition is met to be false. Now if you look at the flow of the while loop, you first start your code and then you go ahead and execute your block. Once you've executed, you go on to check the condition. If it is found to be false, you will exit from the loop, but if it's true, you go back and repeat the set of operation. So I hope you guys are clear with the do while loop. Alright, so before I go ahead and show you the practical of do while loop, let's go ahead and discuss the next loop, that is the while loop, which is quite similar to your do while loop itself. And then we'll have a practical which compares both do and while loop as well. Alright, okay. So the next loop that we're going to be talking about is the while loop. Now the while loop is again quite similar to the do loop, but here what happens is first you check the condition and then you execute the statements. So the main difference here is that in the do loop, at least once the statements gets executed, but in the while loop, only and only if the condition is true will the statement get executed. Now again coming back, so in situations where you need to decide from the input of the user whether you want to execute it multiple number of times or not, you use a do loop. And if you want to execute a statement multiple number of times but you're not sure when to stop, you'll use a while loop. Now your do is a very good example of exit control loop. Now what do I mean by exit control loop again? Is that you're going to execute your set of codes and only then you'll decide whether you need to exit from the loop or not. But when you look at your while, here it's an entry control loop. So what you're doing here is that you're deciding if you have to enter the loop statement or not. So I hope you guys are clear with that. Okay, so I've got a confirmation from everyone. Now again, if you just look at the flow of the while loop, you start off with your code and then you go on to check the condition. If the condition is false, then you exit from the loop. But if it is true, you go on to execute the condition. Then you go back to checking the condition, then you keep executing the block of code until the condition is false. So now what we'll do is we'll go back to our Eclipse and we'll execute a code that involves both do and while condition. So that way we can even compare both the statements. So let me create a new class. I'll call it loops. Now let's take a situation where I'm going to add every alternative number till my sum increases above 50. So I don't know when it is going to start, and I'm going to start from the number 3. Okay, so every second number, that is 3, 5, 7, 9, I'm going to keep adding them till my sum crosses 50. Okay, so in such condition what I'll do is I'm going to use both do and while loop. Alright, okay, so let's say int sum value equal to 3, and I'll even initialize my sum is equal to 0. Then I'm going to use a do while loop where I say do my sum. I'm going to show you how to write a shorthand notation here. So let's say plus equal to value. Okay, so this basically is a shorthand notation that tells my compiler that it needs to take the value of sum, to that add the value, and then store it back into sum. So this is a shorthand notation. So here let me print sum. Let's say out. I'll say sum, and then comes your while condition. Now let's say while my sum is lesser than or equal to 50. Okay, so after the statement put a semicolon, and I'm going to write another statement that is end of loops. Alright, so just save this, let's execute it. So you can see it started from 3 and it's gone on to keep adding the value to 51. So this is basically an increment of 3. Now here I'm going to change it again. Let's say value plus equal to 2. That is, it's going to add 2 every time to my corresponding value. So if I save this and if I rerun this, so you can see I have 3, 8, 15, 24, 35, 48 and then 63. So once it's reached 63, you check whether the sum is lesser than or equal to 50 and you exit from that loop. So this is basically how the loop statement works. Okay, now same statement if I have to translate to a while loop, it's quite straightforward. So I'm going to remove this colon and I'm going to take the while statement from here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the do statement here with the while statement. Okay, so if you just save this and then you can run it. So here you don't see any change with respect to that value. Am I right? So this is just to help you understand how the difference works. Now let's go back to our do while statement. Okay, here what I'm doing is I'm going to change the value of sum to directly as 50 itself. Or let's say I'm going to change it to 51. Okay, so if you save this and if you run it, you can see it is printing the value to be 54 and only then is coming end of loop. Okay, so that means it's executing once. But at the same time, let's say I'm going to replace my do with the while statement here. Okay, and then save it and execute it. Then you can see it's directly printing end of loops. That means it's not even entering this condition because the value of sum is already 51. But when you had seen with respect to the do loop, there it had entered the loop once, it had performed the operation and only then did it check the condition. So with this, I hope you guys are clear with respect to how a do while and a while loop work and how they're different. Okay, that's great to see. So the last loop that we'll be discussing is the for loop. Now, a for loop is also an entry control loop, but how it is different from your while loop is that in a for loop, you know how many times you want to iterate a certain set of statements. Now, if you know that you want to repeat a certain set of statements, let's say 10 times, then you're going to be using a for loop more than a while. So this is the basic syntax of a for loop where you have for keyword. After that you have the initialization, then you have the condition and the iteration. Now initialization basically is going to be assigning a value here so that you can check the condition. So once you have a variable here, you're going to initialize it a value, then you're going to check that variable to your condition. Now you want to run the loop 10 times. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to declare a variable I, I'm going to initialize it to 0, and then I'm going to write in the condition I less than 10. That means it has to start from 0, go all the way till 9, where it's going to execute the statement 10 times, and here the iteration statement. Now this is where you're going to be using a unary operator, where you'll be mentioning I++. That is, increment the value of I once you're executed this certain set of statements. So first you'll initialize the value, then you'll check the condition. If the condition is true, you go into and execute the statements. After you've executed the statements, you iterate and then go back to your condition. Now to give you a better understanding, let's look at the flow of the for loop. So you have your start of the code where you begin with initialization, then you check your condition. If the condition is false, you do not execute the certain set of statements, but if it's true, you execute the set of statements. Once that is true, you process with the iteration and then you go back to checking your condition. So for every time the condition is true, you're going to keep executing the statement as well as performing the iteration as such. Once this condition is found to be false, then you're going to go ahead and exit the loop. So I hope with this you've got an idea. Let's go back to our Eclipse IDE and execute these codes. So same thing, let me just change all this. Now let's take an interesting example here. Let's say the first 15 Fibonacci items. Okay, so I'll start off with int num1 equal to 0, num2 equal to 1, and then let's say num3. Alright, so let's say for int I equal to 0, my I is less than 15. That means it has to find the first 15 Fibonacci items. And finally I++. That is, after it has executed the statements at least once, increment the value of I. Alright, so here itself let me begin off by printing. So instead of println, I'm just going to write print. Okay, and here let's say num1. Similarly, I'm going to copy this and then print num2. Here my num3 is equal to num1 plus num2. Okay, and then I'm going to again print num3. So basically what you need to do is you need to separate these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a quote, put a comma and then close it. Same thing here. Okay, and I'll do the same here. So this will help me in differentiating the values. So Fibonacci is consecutive addition, and you need to remember this is always a string. So what you need to do is that you need to put a plus symbol here. So this actually converts it to string concatenation. Alright. So every time that you're printing a variable along with the string that you need as output, always use a plus operator. So here let me say I need to update my values. So my num1 is equal to num2 and my num2 is equal to num3. So this is basically a consecutive updation. So if you save it and if you run it, you can see it starts off 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, 233, 377, 610 and 98. So basically I have the first 15 elements of my Fibonacci series. So I know I need the first 15 numbers, and that's exactly why I've used the for loop. So when you know the number of times you wish to iterate a statement, that time you're going to be using the for loop. So are we clear with respect to the different loops that are present in Java? Any questions about for, while or do while loop? Okay, so I've got a confirmation from everyone. So the next key topic that we will be discussing is arrays and strings. So an array is basically a data structure in Java that is used to store sequential elements that are of the same type. So again, let's say you have multiple numbers that needs to be stored together. So rather than storing them into different variables, what you can do there is that you can store them in an array. Now these numbers could be anything. These could be an employee ID, or these could be the amounts that you have spent on different days of the month. It could be any value that you're going to need to be stored in a consecutive order. Now, an array basically has two key factors. One is the value and the second is the index. Now, when you talk about the value, it is the actual value that is going to be stored. Now, for an array, you're going to be assigning consecutive memory blocks, and it always is indexed. So your indexing starts from 0 and goes on till n-1 size of the array. Now, let's say you want to extract a specific value. So let's say you are keeping a chart of the amount that you have spent on different days of the month. So my array is called expense and it starts from 0 and it goes all the way till 30 because I have 31 days in the month. Now I want to know how much I have spent on 15th. So if I want to know how much I have spent on 15th, all I need to do is specify the name of the array and then the index, that is your date minus 1, because we are starting from 0. So if I say expense of 14, it will give me the amount that I have spent on 15th of this month. Same thing here. Let's say if you want the value 200, then what you need to do is that specify the name of the array and the index is 4. So I hope with this you've got an idea of what is an array. Now again, don't misunderstand that array is only a sequential memory location. Now array can be either a single dimensional or it can be a multi-dimensional. Now talking about the different types of array, you have again two types, single dimensional and multi-dimensional. So as I had said, now your single dimensional array is a sequential straight memory block, but when you look at your multi-dimensional array, this basically is similar to your matrix in mathematics. So you have a row index as well as you have a column index. So this size can vary as per your requirements. Again, when you look at the process of how to create an array, basically you need to specify the data type of the array, the name of the array followed by square parentheses. Once you're done that, equal to and the new keyword. Now, if you're not familiar with what the new keyword is, it's actually used to allocate memory for objects or data types as such. So here array is considered to be an object, and following that you need to specify the type of array again and then the size of array. So here basically I need to create an array that is of the size 12. So here my indexing starts from 0 and goes on all the way to 11, and then I'm storing the value 1 to 12. So I hope with this you've got a simple idea of how a single dimensional array is. Okay. Now your multi-dimensional array is also quite similar to your single dimensional array itself. It's just a bit extension. Now where you had a single row where you were storing the values, now here you have multiple rows. Now this is very important as well as very useful when you're working with large values that are related to each other. So to give you an example here, let's say you have different vendors and you want to store the amount that you need to pay. So you can have one column which has the vendor details, the other column that has the amount. After that, let's say you need to put another field that has the amount that they have to pay and so forth. So you can have multiple rows in such case, and each column would have a corresponding value. So you can again divide it based on the value stored in a column is for a corresponding vendor, or you can again check if a corresponding row is for a vendor. So it again depends on how you want to create your multi-dimensional array, and arrays are one of the most amazing things that you can play around with Java. Okay, so I'll just show you how to declare and work with different arrays. Now to declare an array, let me create a new class file itself. Let me call it array examples. I'll call it, click on finish. So now comes the time for declaring an array. Now there are multiple ways to declare an array, but the best recommended and the standard way that most professionals follow is first specifying the data type, then the name of array. So let me call it numList. Now if you're going to use a single dimensional array, just put one set of square brackets equal to your new keyword. Again, you need to specify the data type, so int, and finally here what you need to do is you need to specify the size of the array. Now let's say I'm going to create an array of size 10. So again put a colon. Now if you want, you can individually initialize the values of this array. So let's say num list of 0. Now always remember your indexing of array starts from 0 equal to 0 and so forth. You can go ahead and initialize all the 10 values. But easier way to while you're working with arrays is to use loops. Okay, at the same time, let's say if you want to create a multi-dimensional array, then you can create like this. So here you need to specify the second dimension, let's say 5. So this is going to create a multi-dimensional array that has 10 rows and 5 columns. So are you clear on how to work with arrays? Any doubts? Okay, Divya has a doubt here. Divya is asking me how will you print an array? Now it's quite straightforward, Divya. Actually all you need to do is specify the name of the array. So let's say num list, and then you need to specify the index that you want to print. So let's say you want to print the 5th row's second element, then you just need to do that and put it inside your system out statement. Okay, so I've got a confirmation from Sandeep, Adam, James, Nisha, Roshni. That's great to see, guys. So Please keep trying out these operations simultaneously on your Eclipse. So at any point, if you're not clear, if you're facing any challenge, I can clarify it then and there itself. Okay, so when you come down to strings, now strings basically is a collection of your characters. So if you want to store a word, then you can use a string to store that word. But when you compare a string to other programming language like C or C++, here your string is an object and not a data type as such. Okay, so this is one of the major difference between your C++ and Java. Here your string is considered to be an object, not a data type. So again, if you want to create a new string, it's quite straightforward. Just type string and then name of the string, say str equal to Java is easy, semicolon, str, just save it. If you run it, you can see the string gets printed. Okay, Stephanie's asked me, can we not have array of characters? How is it different from strings? So Stephanie, definitely you can have an array of characters as well, but how it differs basically is there are different types. So if you're using an array of characters, it will in turn get converted to a string object itself. Okay, so it's preferred directly you use a string object itself. So again, there are many operations that you can perform on strings, but we'll be talking about them in our next session that goes in detail with respect to strings. Okay, so the next topic we're going to be talking about is functions. So a functions is quite straightforward. It's a block of code that can be reused to perform a single related operation. Now again, if you look at the image here, you want to add two numbers, and for that, rather than writing multiple statements, what you can do is you can write a function that adds two numbers, and you can call it every time with different values. So every time it's calling it with different values, the operation performed is same, but it's going to be returning different values. So in my call 1, I'm going to send the value 3 and 5. In my call 2, I'm going to send 6 and 9. In my call 3, I'm going to send 1 and 5, and this function will just add these two numbers. Once it's added it'll directly send you the result. So here you have it returns 8, returns 15, and returns 6. So are you clear with respect to how a function works? Okay, so there are basically two types of functions that we'll be talking about in Java. There is predefined functions and user-defined functions. Now, when you talk about predefined functions, these are basic functions that are already provided to you from Java itself. Apart from that, let's say you want to perform certain operations, then you're going to write a specific function for that. And that exactly is what you call as a user-defined function. Now, most objects that Java provides you, even your string object has certain set of predefined functions, like let's say you want to concatenate it, you want to find the length of that string. Every one of that operations can be done using your predefined functions. So let me just show you an example of a predefined function. If you go back here and type dot length and save it, if you just run this, you can see it's returning 12. That basically means the length of my string is 12. So you can see Java has 4 letters, easy has 4 letters, is a 2-letter word, that is 10. If you include the 2 white spaces, then you have 12 characters. So basically this is a predefined function that is provided to you from Java, and you're just calling this function which is returning a value. Now at the same time, let's say you want to write a function, then it's quite straightforward as well. Even your main is a function, and actually it is the first function that gets called whenever you're executing your program. That's why I said the execution of your code begins from main. Now if you want to write a function, make sure you're writing it up before your main. So let's say public static, then you need to specify the type of variable that it would be returning. So let's say int, then name of the function, multiply. So this is going to take two arguments, let's say int x followed by int y. Now here don't confuse with how you were declaring variables. If you're going to take two variables as input, make sure you're taking them separately. You need to specify the data type separately as well. You cannot directly write int x comma y. You need to write int x and then again int y. Let's say int result, and my result is equal to x into y. Okay, now I've computed my result. Now this needs to be returned back to the person who's calling this function. So return result. Okay, now come back to your main. Here let's say int a equal to 50, b equal to 20, and I have another one that says output, and I'm going to call the function output equal to multiply of a comma b. That is, you're sending values of a and b to the multiply function, which will compute it, and then it will send the result which will be stored in output. So again, if you just print it, if you just print the output, you have your result. Okay, so I hope with this you've got a general idea of how to write a user defined function and how to call as well as accept a value from a function. So any doubts with respect to functions in Java? Now don't worry, there are a lot of functions that you can write, that is up to your creativity, and Java offers you thousands of inbuilt predefined functions. So make sure you explore at least few of them, and we'll be discussing some of them in our next session as well. You can start off with exploring the predefined functions for string itself. So there are close to 30 different predefined functions for string. So I want all of you to at least try at least 15 or 20 of them, and tomorrow when you come back to your next session, we'll talk about them. Alright? Okay, that's great to see. So please try it out. In case if you have any troubles, if you're not clear with respect to any one of them as well, so we'll be able to discuss that as part of tomorrow's session. Okay, so moving ahead, let's talk about the last topic of today's session, that is classes and objects. Now you've basically seen what a class looks like. A class is basically a blueprint from which your object is created. But then comes the question about what is an object. Now everything that you see around you, we ourselves are object to a class. Okay, because we have certain state, we certain have behaviors. By state, what do I mean is that we have a certain set of variables that are present as part of it. Now this variable could either be our name, it could be our age, it could be our height, it could be our weight, and by behavior, what do I mean? It could be a specific function that we have. Now it could be sleeping, it could be eating, it could be running. These are some of the functions that are present in us. So we are actually objects of a class known as humans. Same time, you have animals, you have cars, you have planes, you have bikes. Everything belongs to everything that you can see around you that has a state, that has a behavior, is an object. And in Java, everything is treated as an object. So every operation that you're going to be performing with objects itself. So I hope with this you've got a general idea of classes and objects. Now we've already seen a class. Let's go ahead and create an object as well associated to a class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class itself. So I'm going to call it student, and then let me create a main for that as well. Now every student will have a name, so let's say string name. Now one thing I want you all to be clear is that if you're using a string, make sure you're specifying the S to be capital. This is a case sensitive operation. Okay, so always if you're using a data type, make sure you're using the correct case for it. Then he's going to have an age, and finally I'm going to give him a student ID. So again int student ID. Okay, so this is basically how the blueprint of a student is going to look like. Any doubts here? So this is basically the states that the student will have. States, again, whenever we talk about states in Java or an object-oriented programming language, it refers to the variables. Alright, so now we need to give him a behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a method known as a constructor. Okay, now we're not going to deep dive into constructor. We'll be talking about the constructor more in our classes session, but for now you just need to understand that a constructor is a basic function or a methodology which will help you initialize values to your objects that you create. Okay, and always your constructors have the same name as your class. So now that we have designed the blueprint of a class, it's time we go ahead and create an object for this class. Now creating an object in itself is a very straightforward process. So all you need to do is specify the name of the class to which the object belongs to. In this case it's student, and then name of the object, let's say S1 in this case. Then comes your equal to and new keyword. Okay, so again, by new what you're meaning is that you need to assign some memory for this object, so you're going to use the new keyword. New, and finally you need to specify the type again, so that's student, and you're done with it. So basically through this what you've done is that you have created a new object S1 that belongs to this class student. But every student needs to have certain set of values. So what we're going to do is that we're going to write two methods that would belong to this class. First is a method called constructor. Now a constructor is one of the most basic methods that would belong to a class. Now we're not going to deep dive into that, but to put it very straightforwardly, this is a method that is used to initialize values to a object when it's created. So this will have the same name as the class, so just write public and then name of the class. Now for initializing, this is also a function, so it requires certain parameters. So since we have three variables that are part of the class, we're going to use all three of them. So let me say string. You can't use the same name as the variables that you have declared here. So let's say sname, comma, int sage, and finally int sid. Okay. Now what I need to do, I need to assign these values to my existing values. So all you need to do is name equal to sname, my age equal to sage, and finally student ID is equal to sid. So basically every time I'm creating an object, I'm going to send these three values. So I need to send it here. So first is a string, so let's say Mayank is my student, so Mayank. Then comes his age, so Mayank, please don't get offended, so I'm going to make you 15 years old. And then your student ID is 100. Okay. Now finally I'm going to write one more function. Now the main objective of the function that I'm going to write, that is void display. So it needs to be public again, so let's say public. It's not going to take any arguments. So you would have guessed what the aim of this is. It's basically to help me check the values that are stored for these fields, that is the name, age, and student ID. So we can write this out, and let me say the student name is the colon, and then I had mentioned to you earlier, if you want to print something with a string, always put a plus symbol. And then I need sname. I need to print the name value. Alright, so again I'll just copy the statement, the age, and then you have the student ID, so now I have written a function that basically displays these values for the object from which I'm going to call it. The object from which I'm going to call this function is s1. So s1 dot, so you can see you have different options here. So I need to call the display function, so just click on display, and that's it. If you save this program and then rerun it, so you can see here the output, that is the student name is Mayank, the student age is 15, and the student ID is 100. Similarly, let me create another object. Let's say student s2 equal to new of student, where I'm going to pass the values as, let's say Ajay, his age is 16, and his student ID is 150. I'll just call s2.display and save it and execute it. So here I have details of Mayank, here I have details of Ajay. So you can see the difference here, can't you? I mean, when I'm calling the same function using different objects, I'm getting different values. That helps you understand how unique each object is. Although it is the same logic that I'm writing in the display function, but since I'm using two different objects to call them, a different output is coming. So are you clear with respect to objects and classes? Alright, so I've got a confirmation from everyone. Now with this we come to a conclusion of today's session. So let's summarize what we learned today. We started off with installing Java on our system as well as Eclipse on our system. Then we went on to discuss the various data types that are supported in Java as well as the various data operators. Then we saw the different conditional statements. We saw if, else and switch case. After that we saw the various loops. We discussed do while loop and for loop and how they are different. Then I also helped you understand how a function works. We saw both user-defined function as well as built-in function. Finally, we discussed about classes and objects, and we saw them with an example of a student class. So with this, we're going to end the session. Do any of you have any questions or queries with respect to any of the concepts that we have discussed, or would you like me to repeat any specific concept that you are not clear on? Alright, so before I end today's session, please remember that when you're coming for tomorrow's session, you need to have at least 15 inbuilt functions that are associated to string class. Okay, so all you need to do is create a new string, then use the string object, put a dot operator, and then try out it. So when you're working with Eclipse, you can see what are the inputs that it requires, how does this built-in function work, and so forth. Okay, so please do try it out, and if you're not clear or if you face trouble anywhere, do let me know in tomorrow's session. Hope you have a great learning experience. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply to them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to our Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!